It is a plain truth, seldom spoken aloud in drawing rooms, that a man may be judged not by how he bows to those above him, but by how he speaks to those who can do nothing for him in return. Lady Augusta Hale had said as much to her grandson 100 times before he ever thought to test it, and 100 times he had nodded and gone on precisely as before. The way a boy nods at a lesson he does not yet believe he will ever need. He would need it, in the end, on an evening he could not have imagined for himself, in a room grown suddenly and terribly quiet, before a woman who set down her cup with such care that the small sound of porcelain meeting saucer seemed louder than anything he had ever said in his life. That evening was still many months away when Eleanor Vane first came up the long drive of Ashcombe Hall in a hired cart, her trunk roped shut with twine, because the clasp had broken somewhere between Thornmoor and the crossroads, and her gloves mended so many times at the seams that she had stopped noticing the stitches. She was 27, unmarried, and entirely without expectation of becoming otherwise, which suited her better than anyone in her family had ever managed to believe. Her father had been a country parson with a scholar's mind and a curate's income, a man who taught her Latin before he taught her patience, and when the fever took both her parents inside the same fortnight, it left her with a small trunk of books, a smaller sum of money, and no relation willing to take on a grown woman who read too much and wept too little in company. She had been a companion twice before Ashcombe, once to a querulous widow in Harrogate who complained of draughts that did not exist, and once to a merchant's wife in Leeds who wanted less a companion than an audience. Neither position had broken her, though both had taught her the particular discipline required of women in her situation, the art of being present without being seen, of anticipating a need before it was voiced, and never once suggesting that the anticipating cost her anything. She arrived at Ashcombe with that discipline settled into her like a second spine, and she arrived too, with a private hope she did not examine too closely, that the Dowager Duchess might prove a kinder post than the ones before. The hope was not disappointed, though it took a little time to prove itself. Lady Augusta Hale was 73, sharp as a needle and twice as likely to draw blood if provoked, and she received her new companion in a chair by the window, with her spectacles pushed up into a nest of white hair, regarding Eleanor for a long moment before she spoke a single word. "You have an honest face, girl. I have had 4 companions in as many years, and every one of them lied to me about my hearing, my eyesight, and my chances of living past Christmas. I find I have grown tired of being managed. Can you manage not to manage me? I can try, Your Grace, though I confess I have never been much good at managing anyone, including myself." The old woman laughed, a short bark of real amusement that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised Eleanor, and from that first exchange something settled between them that neither called friendship for a long while, though it was friendship, plainly, and grew steadier with every week that passed. Eleanor read to her in the evenings, argued with her over cards, and refused, gently but absolutely, to pretend the old woman's failing hip was nothing when it plainly pained her. Lady Augusta, for her part, began to speak more and complain less, and the housekeeper remarked to the cook within the first month that her ladyship had not been so lively since the old Duke died. Ashcombe Hall itself sat at the edge of a Yorkshire moor that turned every colour between green and iron depending on the hour, a grey stone house with too many empty rooms and not enough warm ones, its long gallery hung with the portraits of Hales going back further than anyone troubled to count. Eleanor came to love it in the quiet, unhurried way one comes to love a place that asks nothing of you but attention. She walked the moor path in the mornings before her duties began, learned the names of the tenant families from the housekeeper, and found in the vast cold library a comfort she had not expected to find anywhere again after her father's death. The house did not know yet that its master was coming home, and neither, in truth, did Eleanor think of him at all, beyond the occasional remark of Lady Augusta's, delivered with a sigh that suggested old grief carefully managed rather than fresh. "My grandson will visit in the spring," Lady Augusta remarked one evening, laying down her cards with unusual care. "He has not been himself these 2 years, and I do not expect him to arrive himself now. You will forgive him if he is cold to you. He has learned to be cold to everyone, and I have not yet found the argument that will teach him otherwise." Eleanor spent the remaining months of that winter learning Ashcombe in the thorough way she had learnt every household before it. Not merely its rooms and its routines, but its people, the tenant families scattered across the moor, whose names Lady Augusta still kept in careful memory, though her hip no longer allowed her to visit them herself. It became, without any formal arrangement, Eleanor's task to carry the old woman's baskets of preserves and remedies out to the cottages when illness or hard weather made a visit necessary, and she came in this way to know Thornmoor and its people better than most companions ever troubled to know the families their employers governed. There was a widow named Hannah Croft with 4 children and a leaking roof the steward had promised to mend for above a year without ever quite finding the time. And there was old Tom Ridley, who had served the previous Duke as huntsman, and now kept mostly to his fire, glad of company and gladder still of the strong tea Eleanor learned to brew exactly as he liked it. She listened to their small griefs and smaller triumphs with the same unhurried attention she gave Lady Augusta, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that Ashcombe had begun to feel less like a post to be endured, and more like a place she might, given the choosing, wish to stay. It was on one of these visits, in the last raw week of March, that she first properly understood the scale of what the household expected from the coming spring. For Hannah Croft asked, with the particular bluntness of a woman who has no patience left for delicacy, whether it was true the young Duke was finally coming home to see to things properly, and whether he meant to be a better landlord than his own father had been, who had let the roof go unmended and the rents rise all in the same breath. Eleanor could offer no honest answer beyond what Lady Augusta herself had said, that the family did not yet know what sort of man had come back from London, only that he had not been himself these 2 years, and Hannah Croft had sniffed at that, and said that grief made some men harder and some men kinder, and there was no telling in advance which sort he would prove to be. And Eleanor had ridden the cart back to the hall turning the widow's words over long after the conversation itself had ended. Eleanor asked no questions, because it was not her place to ask, though she gathered enough from the servants' careful silences, and the one letter Lady Augusta read aloud in a voice gone suddenly flat, that the Duke of Ashcombe, Gideon Hale, had been engaged to a Lady Isabel Farrow the year before, and that Lady Isabel had broken the engagement 3 weeks before the wedding to marry a wealthier man, and had done so in a manner calculated to be seen and discussed by every drawing-room in London. Whatever kindness had lived in the Duke before that spring, the household seemed to agree without quite saying so, had gone somewhere private and had not yet found its way back. The old footman who had served the family longest confided to Eleanor once, over a shared pot of tea in the servants' hall on a slow afternoon, that he remembered the young master as a boy who had wept openly at the death of a favourite horse and had once given his own winter coat to a tenant's son without telling a soul, and that whatever London society had done to harden him since, the footman did not believe it had reached all the way down to the root, only buried it deep enough that a careless observer might mistake the burying for the whole truth of the man. He came in April, on a day when the moor was still half frozen and the daffodils along the drive had only just found the courage to open. Eleanor was crossing the entrance hall with a tray of Lady Augusta's morning chocolate, when the front doors opened on a gust of cold air and a tall man in a greatcoat the colour of wet slate, who stood for a moment on the threshold as though the house itself required his permission before he could enter it. He was younger than she had pictured, not yet 40, with dark hair cut close, and a face that might once have been given easily to laughter, judging by the lines around his mouth that had not entirely faded, though nothing in his present expression suggested laughter of any kind. His eyes found her for exactly as long as it took to determine she was a servant and not worth further attention, and then moved past her toward the stairs. "Where is my grandmother?" "In the blue drawing room, Your Grace, waiting for her chocolate, which I am at this moment attempting to deliver before it grows cold. So if you would forgive me." He looked at her again then, more fully, as though the reply had not been the one he expected from a woman carrying a tray, and something flickered behind his eyes that might have been surprise, or might merely have been the particular fatigue of a long journey. He said nothing further, only inclined his head a fraction, and continued up the stairs 2 at a time, and Eleanor stood a moment longer than necessary in the cold hall before she remembered the chocolate and hurried after him. The reunion between grandmother and grandson, when Eleanor delivered the tray and made to withdraw, was conducted with a formality that struck her as almost unbearably sad. Lady Augusta held out both hands, and the Duke took them, and pressed a dutiful kiss to her brow. And they exchanged the ordinary courtesies of health and travel and weather, and underneath every sentence ran a current of things neither of them said. Eleanor withdrew as soon as she decently could, and it was only later, folding linens in the small sitting-room that had become her own particular corner of the house, that she found herself thinking of the look on his face in the hall, the swift assessment and dismissal, and told herself firmly that it meant nothing to her one way or the other. It meant, in fact, remarkably little for the first fortnight. The Duke kept to his study and his correspondence, and rode the more alone in weather that would have discouraged most men, and Eleanor kept to her duties, and the two of them crossed paths only at the edges of the day, in hallways and doorways, with the barest civility passing between them. He was, she came to understand from watching rather than asking, a man rebuilding himself out of very particular materials, discipline and distance, and the steady management of an estate that did not require his grief so long as his ledgers were kept in order. She thought, in the private honesty she allowed herself only at night, that she recognised something of her own discipline in his, the same architecture of a person who has learned that showing the crack invites someone to widen it. The turn, when it came sideways, as such things often do. Lady Augusta's hip worsened with a cold snap in early May, and she took to her bed for the better part of a week, fretful and frightened in a way she was too proud to name as either, and Eleanor sat with her through 2 bad nights, reading aloud until her voice grew hoarse, and mixing the doctor's draughts with a steadiness that kept the old woman from seeing her own fear reflected in anyone else's face. It was on the 2nd of those nights, past midnight, that the Duke found her in the corridor outside his grandmother's room, refilling a basin at the linen press, with her hair coming loose from its pins and exhaustion plain across her face. And he stopped where he might once have simply passed by. "You have not slept. Neither has your Grace, judging by the state of your cravat, which has clearly been abandoned rather than removed." He almost smiled then, the ghost of it visible for perhaps a second before he mastered it away, and he took the basin from her hands without asking, an act so unexpected that she let him, too tired to argue the point of dignity that would ordinarily have kept her from surrendering any task at all. "She is fond of you. More fond, I think, than she has been of any companion since my own mother. I am fond of her in return, your Grace. She does not require me to pretend to be anything I am not, which I have found is rarer than it ought to be among the great houses I have served." He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, as though weighing the sentence for some hidden barb and finding, to his evident surprise, that none was there, only plain truth offered without artifice. Something in his face eased a fraction, not warmth exactly, but the loosening of a man who has braced so long against an expected blow that its absence disorients him. "You are not what I expected, when I saw you crossing the hall that first morning." "And what did your Grace expect?" He did not answer that, only handed the refilled basin back to her and told her, in a voice gone suddenly formal again, to send for him if his grandmother's condition worsened before dawn, and walked away down the corridor with his shoulders set in the particular stiffness of a man retreating from a door he had, for one unguarded moment, come too close to opening. Lady Augusta recovered, as she was determined to do out of sheer contrariness, and the household settled back into its rhythms, though something had shifted in the space between the Duke and his grandmother's companion that neither of them named but both of them felt. He began to appear more often where she was, not by design, she told herself, only by the natural traffic of a house with a limited number of rooms worth occupying. He found her in the library one wet afternoon with a book of her father's Latin poetry open on her knee, and instead of withdrawing as he might once have done, he asked, with an awkwardness that sat strangely on a man otherwise so composed, what she was reading. Ovid. Your Grace. My father's copy. He taught me to read it before he taught me to properly manage a household, which my aunts always considered a poor arrangement of priorities. And do you agree with your aunts? Never. And she looked up at him with an honesty she had not quite intended to show, and something passed between them in that look that neither of them could afterward have named precisely, though both of them thought of it, separately, more often than either would have admitted. There was, that same week, a small incident that neither of them spoke of again, but that Eleanor privately counted among the truest evidence of the man beneath the Duke's careful armour. She had found, on the moor path above Hanacroft's cottage, a sheepdog pup caught fast in a length of wire fencing, half starved and too frightened to let anyone near, and she had knelt in the mud for above an hour trying to coax it close without success, her gloves ruined and her patience nearly spent, when the Duke came upon her by chance on his morning ride and dismounted without a word of question. He did not attempt, as she half expected, to simply free the animal by force and be done with it, but knelt beside her in the same mud, ruining a coat that had cost more than her whole year's wages, and spoke to the frightened creature in a low steady voice until it stopped straining against the wire long enough for his hands, far larger and far more patient than she would have credited him, to work the metal free without further injury. The pup bit him for his trouble, a shallow scrape across the back of one hand, and he only laughed, an unguarded sound she had not yet heard from him, and said that he supposed he had earned it for taking so long about the rescue. You are gentler than you let anyone see, Your Grace. Gentleness is not much prized in a man of my position. It reads as weakness to men like my uncle, and weakness, in my uncle's accounting, is a currency that gets spent by everyone around you the moment they notice you carrying it. And is that truly what you believe, or only what you have been told so often you have stopped troubling to argue with it? He had no answer for that, not then, only looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, some mixture of surprise and something warmer he was not yet ready to name, and carried the rescued pup back to Hanacroft's cottage himself, refusing the widow's flustered thanks with an awkwardness that told Eleanor plainly he was unused to being thanked for anything at all. The pup grew, over the following months, into a rangy, devoted creature that took to following Eleanor on her cottage visits, with an attachment the widow's children found endlessly amusing, and Eleanor came, without quite meaning to think of the animal's blind loyalty as a small living proof that trust once properly earned did not require grand gestures to hold fast, only the patient, unglamorous work of showing up. The summer that followed was, in the private accounting Eleanor kept and never wrote down, the happiest of her adult life, though happiness was not a word either of them used aloud, and though nothing occurred that any observer could have called improper. He rode with her sometimes on the moor path in the early mornings when neither of them could sleep, at a respectable distance and with a groom always somewhere behind, and they argued about poetry and politics and the proper management of tenant farms, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that he listened to her opinions as though they carried actual weight, which no man of his rank had ever troubled to do before. He asked her once, on one such morning, what she would do with an estate if it were hers to manage, expecting perhaps a polite deflection, and was met instead with a considered answer that took in tenant leases and drainage, and the proper timing of harvest wages with a thoroughness that made him laugh aloud and admit that his own steward could learn something from her, a remark she took as the compliment it plainly was, rather than the flattery it might have been from another man's mouth. He was, beneath the discipline he wore like armour, a man of real feeling, quick to notice when a tenant's roof wanted mending before the steward thought to mention it, patient with his grandmother's sharper moods in a way that spoke of old tenderness rather than duty alone, and slow, so slow, to trust that any kindness offered him was offered without a hidden cost. It was Lady Augusta who first said the dangerous thing aloud, over cards one evening in late June, with the particular relish of an old woman who has decided that subtlety has served her poorly enough in life to abandon it entirely. "You are in love with my companion, Gideon. You have been for above a month, and every servant in this house has noticed it before you managed to. That is an absurd suggestion, and I would thank you not to make it in front of the very person in question, who is sitting not 10 feet away, pretending very hard to read a book she has not turned a page of in some minutes." Eleanor, mortified, turned a page at last, though she could not have said afterward what was written on it, and the Duke rose from the table with a stiffness that fooled no one and excused himself to his study. And Lady Augusta watched him go with the satisfied expression of a general who has moved a piece precisely where she wished it, though she said nothing further and only returned, with evident enjoyment, to the game. The trouble, when it arrived in the shape of Lady Constance Pride, a handsome young woman of considerable fortune and considerably more ambition, brought to Ashcombe by her mother for a fortnight's visit that had been arranged, Eleanor gathered from the servants, some months before the Duke's own arrival, by correspondence between his late mother's oldest friend and Lady Pride herself, in the vague hope of a match that would restore both the Ashcombe coffers, thinned by the old Duke's mismanagement, and the Duke's own standing after the humiliation of his broken engagement. Lady Constance was not unkind, precisely, though she possessed the particular blindness of the very fortunate, an inability to conceive that a companion in a mended gown might be worth noticing at all, let alone worth fearing, and she treated Eleanor throughout the visit with the pleasant, absent condescension one might extend to a well-trained dog. The Duke, to his credit, showed Lady Constance nothing beyond the ordinary courtesy owed a guest, and spent rather more of the fortnight than propriety strictly allowed finding reasons to be wherever Eleanor happened to be instead, a pattern so obvious that even Lady Constance's mother, a woman not naturally given to subtlety either, began to watch the companion with narrowed eyes and a calculating set to her mouth. It was Lady Pride who wrote, before the fortnight was out, to a cousin in London whose particular talent lay in the swift and thorough circulation of gossip, and it was that letter, more than anything Eleanor or the Duke had done, that set the trouble properly in motion. By the time the fortnight ended and the Prides departed, with considerably less warmth than they had arrived, London already murmured that the Duke of Ashcombe, still smarting from one public humiliation, was making a fresh fool of himself over his grandmother's companion, a parson's daughter with no fortune and no name worth mentioning, and that Lady Augusta, in her dotage, was encouraging the match out of sheer contrariness towards society's expectations. The gossip found its way north within a fortnight, as gossip always does, carried in letters and in the careless remarks of visiting neighbours, and it found Gideon at precisely the moment his own mother's family, the Farthings, arrived at Ashcombe for a long-promised visit, bringing with them all the weight of a name that had been humiliated once already, and had no intention of being humiliated. Twice. His uncle, Lord Farthing, a man of considerable pride and considerably less warmth, took the Duke aside on the second evening of the visit, and spoke to him in terms that Eleanor was never meant to overhear, though the library door had been left imperfectly closed, and she had come to return a book at precisely the wrong moment, and stood frozen in the corridor rather than announce herself, and compound the awkwardness. You made a fool of yourself once already over Isabel Farrow, and the whole of London watched you do it. Do not, I beg you, compound that folly by making yourself a second fool over a companion with no fortune and no family worth the name. Marry Lady Constance, or marry someone of similar standing, and put this ridiculous business to rest before it costs the family more than it has already cost you. There is nothing between myself and Miss Fane that requires putting to rest, is there not? The whole of London believes otherwise, and I have watched you these 3 days, Gideon. You are transparent as glass on the subject, and it will not do. A duke does not marry his grandmother's companion. It has never been done in this family, and will not begin with you. Eleanor did not wait to hear the duke's answer, if answer he gave at all, but withdrew to her room with her heart beating in a manner that frightened her, and lay awake long into the night turning the conversation over and over, searching it for reassurance and finding, instead, only the cold clarity of her own situation laid bare. She was a companion. She had no fortune, no family name, nothing to offer a duke beyond her own regard, which the world had just informed her, in terms too plain to misread, was worth precisely nothing when weighed against the family's standing. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, found her the following morning paler than usual over the mending basket, and, being a woman who had served the family above 20 years, and had buried her own share of hopes along the way, sat down uninvited, and spoke with a particular frankness servants sometimes permit themselves when they judge the moment requires it, rather than the rank. You have heard something you did not like, and I will not pretend I do not know what it likely was, for Lord Farthing's voice carries further than he thinks it does when the library door is not properly shut. I will tell you only this, Miss Fane, because I think no one else in this house has the courage to say it plainly. His Grace's uncle has never once in 20 years said a kind word about anyone who did not first bring money or title through that front door, and his opinion of what a duke owes his family has cost this house more warmth than any single quarrel with the tenants ever could. I do not say this to raise your hopes. I say it only so that whatever happens next, you do not mistake one bitter man's opinion for the whole truth of this family. I do not know that it matters what I mistake it for, Mrs. Pruitt. I am a companion. Lord Farthing is not wrong about what that means, however unkindly he means it. Being right about a fact and being right about its worth are two very different matters, and I have lived long enough to watch a great many titled fools mistake the first for the second and pay for it later. Eat your breakfast, child. Whatever comes will come, regardless of whether you have the strength to face it, and it is easier faced on a full stomach. Eleanor managed a faint smile at that, the first since overhearing the conversation in the library, and ate what she could, though the words offered little true comfort against the deeper fear that had settled into her overnight, that whatever regard the Duke held for her, it might yet prove no match for the accumulated weight of his family's expectations, his own wound, and a world that had already once taught him the cost of trusting, where trust was not, in the end, repaid. The dinner that followed, 2 evenings later, was arranged by Lady Farthing, with a guest list calculated to remind the Duke of exactly what was expected of him. Half the county's gentry and Lady Pride herself invited back with a haste that spoke of calculated intent rather than genuine warmth, her daughter Constance seated pointedly at the Duke's right hand. Eleanor attended as she always did, in her place at the lower end of the table beside Lady Augusta, in a gown that had been turned twice and mended at the hem, saying little, as was proper, and watching the Duke grow steadily more brittle as the evening wore on, his uncle's earlier words plainly still working in him like a splinter too deep to draw. It was Lady Pride who raised the subject, with the practised cruelty of a woman who has decided that a wound left open serves her purposes better than one allowed to close, remarking over the second course, in a voice pitched to carry, that she had heard the most extraordinary rumour in town, that his Grace was rather taken with his grandmother's companion, and was it true, and how very charming. Though of course one must wonder whether such an attachment could ever be more than a passing fancy, given the young woman's want of any real connections. The table had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone present understands that something significant is about to be said, and Eleanor felt every eye turned toward her, however briefly, before turning to the Duke, and she kept her own eyes on her plate and her hands steady around her teacup, and told herself, with a discipline that had carried her through worse rooms than this one, that whatever came next, she would not be the one to flinch first. The Duke, cornered by his uncle's earlier warning, and his aunt's careful staging, and Lady Pride's public needling all at once, and stung besides by 2 years of a wound that had never properly healed, said the thing that would echo in that room, and in Eleanor's memory, for the rest of both their lives. There is no attachment worth remarking on. Miss Vane is my grandmother's companion, nothing more, and I would ask the table to remember it. I can find 100 women like her in any drawing-room in London, should I ever have need of one. It is hardly a subject that merits this much attention. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water, and for a moment nobody moved at all, not even Lady Pride, who had wanted a reaction and had plainly not expected one quite this sharp. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face and then return in a hot rush, felt every kindness of the summer, every early morning ride and every argument over poetry, and every unguarded look in the library collapse suddenly into something that could be dismissed in a single sentence over the second course of a dinner she had not wanted to attend. She thought, in the strange clarity that sometimes arrives with the worst pain, of her father, who had taught her that dignity was the one possession no one could take from a person who refused to surrender it, and she set down her cup. She set it down with such deliberate care, so slowly and so precisely onto its saucer, that the small sound of porcelain meeting porcelain carried the length of the table more clearly than any raised voice could have done, and she rose from her chair and she looked at no one, not the Duke, not Lady Pride, not even Lady Augusta, whose hand had come up as though to stop her, and stopped instead in the air, unfinished. She walked the length of the dining room with her spine straight and her chin level and her heart breaking in a manner no one at that table would ever be permitted to witness, and she did not hurry, because hurrying would have looked like flight, and she was not fleeing. She was leaving, and there was a difference she intended to preserve even now. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the dining room remained silent for what felt to everyone present like a very long time, until Lady Augusta set down her own fork with a force that rattled the china and fixed her grandson with a look that made Lord Farthing, seated nearby, suddenly find great interest in his wine-glass. "You great fool, you have just thrown away the finest thing that has happened to this family in 30 years, and you have done it in front of the very people whose good opinion you least require, and whose worst opinion you have now guaranteed. I hope you are satisfied with your evening, Gideon, because I am not certain I shall ever forgive you for it." Gideon did not answer his grandmother, could not in truth find any words at all, and sat through the remainder of a dinner he did not taste, aware with a growing and sickening clarity of exactly what he had done and exactly why he had done it. Cornered pride mistaking cruelty for armour, and finding that the armour, now that it was on, fit nothing at all like protection, and everything like a cage of his own making. Eleanor did not sleep that night, nor did she weep, not at first, occupying herself instead with the practical business of packing her trunk by candlelight, folding her few gowns with the same steady hands that had folded linens and mixed draughts and managed households for 7 years, without once allowing anyone to see what the managing cost her. It was only near dawn, with the trunk closed and roped and her letter of resignation written and sealed on the small writing desk, that the discipline finally broke, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and wept for the better part of an hour, not for the loss of a position, which she could replace, but for the loss of a summer she had allowed herself. Against every lesson her situation had taught her, to believe might be more than temporary. She left before the household woke properly, walking the 2 miles to the village of Thornmore on foot, with her trunk sent for separately, and took the early mail coach south to Harrogate, where a former mistress, the querulous widow of her first position, had once mentioned in a letter that her own companion was leaving to be married, and a replacement would eventually be wanted. Eleanor arrived on the widow's doorstep with no notice at all, explained only that her circumstances had changed, and was taken in within the hour, because competent companions willing to manage a difficult old woman for a modest wage were not so easily found that any sensible employer turned one away for want of warning. At Ashcombe, the morning brought a silence to the house that every servant remarked upon, without daring to say so aloud in the Duke's hearing. Lady Augusta refused to leave her rooms and refused. When the Duke came to see her, to speak more than a dozen words to him, all of them cold, and the housekeeper reported, with the particular satisfaction of servants everywhere when their betters have plainly earned a reckoning, that Miss Vane's letter of resignation had been found on the desk, and that Miss Vane herself had left before first, light without a word to anyone. Gideon read the letter 3 times in his study before its full weight settled into him properly. It was short, correct, entirely without reproach, thanking Lady Augusta for her kindness, and regretting only that circumstances made her continued service impossible, and it was the very absence of reproach that undid him most thoroughly. Because a woman who had cause to rage, and chose instead to leave with quiet dignity and tact, had proved, in the leaving, every word he had said about her false, and every fear his uncle had voiced about his own character entirely justified. He rode out that same morning without a groom and without a destination, and found himself, some hours later, at the edge of the moor path they had walked together all that summer, standing in the cold wind with the daffodils long since given way to full green summer growth, and understood, standing there alone, that he had done precisely what his uncle feared, and precisely what his own wound had. Trained him to do, mistaken the protection of pride for the protection of the heart, and lost, in a single careless sentence delivered to save face before people whose opinion he did not even value, the one honest thing that had come into his life since Isabel Farrow taught him to distrust every kindness offered him. Lady Augusta, when he returned, was waiting for him in the blue drawing-room, upright in her chair despite the pain it plainly cost her hip, and she did not soften her voice at all when she spoke. Do you know what I admired most in that girl? Gideon, not her patience, though she had plenty of it, and not her kindness, though that too. It was that she never once, in a year of service, asked me for anything beyond what was owed her. She managed my moods and my illness and my grief for your grandfather without ever once trading on it, without ever once suggesting I owed her more warmth in return for the warmth she gave. And you stood in a room full of people who have never given this family anything worth the name, and you told them she was worth 100 like her. You did not merely insult her, Gideon, you insulted everything decent left in this house. I know it. Knowing it is not enough. What do you intend to do about it? He did not answer immediately, because he did not yet know, though the shape of an answer was already forming in him, unfamiliar and frightening in the way that real change always is to a man who has spent 2 years building his safety out of distance and control. He knew only that the cage of his own pride had closed around him the moment the words left his mouth, and that the only door out of it lay in the same direction the moment had pointed, toward the truth he had been too cornered and too afraid to speak aloud in that dining-room, and toward a woman who had walked out of his house, and, he feared, out of any willingness to hear him say it now. It took him the better part of a week to learn where she had gone. A week spent writing letters to every connection Lady Augusta could name, and finally, in desperation, questioning the mail coach driver in Thornmore himself, a piece of investigation so far beneath his rank that the driver could not entirely conceal his astonishment at being questioned by a duke in person on a public road. The trail led, eventually and with some difficulty, to Harrogate and to the widow's house, and Gideon arrived there on a grey morning in July, having ridden through the night rather than wait for a coach, travel worn and unshaven, and entirely without the composure that had once been his most reliable armour. The widow's maid who answered the door regarded him with open suspicion until he gave his name and his rank, at which point suspicion gave way to flustered confusion, and he was shown, after some delay, into a small parlour where Eleanor sat with a mending basket in her lap, her face going pale, and then very carefully still when she saw who had entered the room. "Your Grace, I confess I did not expect you. I do not imagine you did. I would not have blamed you for refusing to see me at all, and I am grateful, more than I can properly say, that you have not." She set down the mending, though not with the deliberate ceremony of that other evening, only the ordinary movement of a woman uncertain what her hands ought to do, and waited, saying nothing, because it was not her place to make this easy for him, and because some part of her, still raw from the wound of that dining-room, was not yet certain she wished to. "I have come to tell you that what I said in that room was a lie, the worst lie I have told in my life, and I told it not because I believed a word of it, but because I was cornered by my own family and my own pride, and too much of a coward to say, in front of people whose good opinion I have never truly valued, what was actually true. There is no woman like you, Eleanor. I have known a great many women in my life, women of fortune and name and considerable accomplishment, and not one of them ever managed what you managed without effort in the space of a single summer, which was to make me believe that honesty and kindness might still exist in the world without a hidden cost attached. I threw that away in a single sentence to protect myself from my uncle's disapproval, and I have spent every hour since regretting it with a completeness I did not know myself capable of feeling. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded very still in her lap, and when she spoke her voice was steady, though it cost her something to keep it so. "Do you know what frightened me most? Hearing you say it. It was not that you might have believed it. I do not think, even in that moment, that I believed you believed it. It was that you were willing to let the whole room believe it, and let me stand there and be made small in front of people who had never earned the right to judge me, rather than risk the smaller discomfort of telling the truth. I have spent my whole life being told, in one fashion or another, that I am replaceable, that a companion is a companion and one will do as well as the next, and I had allowed myself, foolishly, to believe that you at least saw me otherwise. I am not certain, Your Grace, that an apology delivered a week later in a borrowed parlour undoes the damage of a sentence spoken in front of 40 witnesses. It does not undo it. I do not imagine anything could undo it entirely, and I would not ask you to pretend otherwise for my comfort. But I have not come merely to apologise, Eleanor, though I owe you that apology more completely than I have ever owed anyone anything. I have come to ask you to consider whether a man who has recognised his own worst failing and travelled through the night to say so in person, without a single witness to make the gesture easy or safe for himself, might be worth a second chance to prove it was not the whole truth of his character. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since a night in a cold corridor when you told me you were fond of my grandmother, because she did not ask you to pretend to be anything you were not, and I would like, very much, the chance to be a man who never again asks that of you either. The parlour was very quiet after that, the only sound the widow's clock on the mantel and the distant clatter of the kitchen below, and Eleanor sat with the whole of that quiet summer and that one terrible dinner and this unexpected, unarmoured morning all moving through her at once, and found, when she finally spoke, that the anger had not entirely left her, but that something else had grown up alongside it strong enough to be heard over it. I will not pretend the wound is healed simply because you have ridden through the night to speak of it, Your Grace. That would be its own kind of dishonesty, and I have had enough of dishonesty, kindly meant or otherwise, to last a lifetime. But I did not stop loving you the moment I set down that cup, however much I might have wished to, for my own protection. And I find I am not entirely willing to let a single cornered sentence be the last word between us, if you are willing to prove over time, and not merely in one dramatic morning, that it was not the truest thing you have ever said of me. That is more grace than I deserve, and I intend to spend a very long time earning the rest of it. He did not press her further that morning, understanding with a clarity his pride had denied him for 2 years, that trust broken publicly could not be mended privately in a single conversation, however sincerely meant. And he returned to Ashcombe alone, leaving Eleanor to her position and her own considered time. The widow of Harrogate, a shrewd old woman despite her many complaints, watched her new companion grow quieter and more thoughtful over the following weeks, and eventually remarked, without much preamble, that she had not raised the subject before because it was none of her business, but that a duke did not generally ride through the night on a matter of no consequence, and perhaps Eleanor ought to consider what she actually wanted, rather than what pride or caution suggested she ought to want. Eleanor found she had no ready answer, only the slow, private work of sorting one true feeling from another. The anger that still surfaced unbidden when she remembered the dinner-table's silence, and beneath it, stubborn and undiminished, the memory of a cold corridor and a man who had once told her she was not what he expected and had meant it, she now understood, as the beginning of something rather than a dismissal. He wrote to her every week through the remainder of that summer, honest letters with no flourish or performance in them, telling her of his grandmother's health and the tenant harvest, and his own slow, deliberate work at becoming a man whose word in private matched his word in company, whatever the company's expectations. He wrote, too, of smaller things she had not expected him to notice or remember, that Hannah Croft's roof had finally been properly mended, on his own direct order and at his own expense, and that the rescued sheepdog pup had grown into a fine, watchful animal that the widow's children had named, with more sentiment than originality, Duke, he wrote of Lord Farthing's continued disapproval, born now with a steadiness that no longer bent beneath it, and of a conversation with Lady Pride in which he had corrected, plainly and without apology, the rumour that Eleanor had been dismissed for impertinence, stating instead, in a drawing-room full of the very people who had witnessed his original cruelty, that Miss Vane had left Ashcombe because he had failed her, and that the failure was entirely his own to mend if mending proved possible at all. Eleanor kept every letter in the same small trunk that had once carried her few gowns up the long drive to Ashcombe, and she read them in the quiet hour before bed, with a care that surprised her, watching the man in the words grow steadier and more honest with each passing week, until the anger that had carried her out of that dining room had softened, without ever quite vanishing, into something she could finally examine without flinching. He did not visit again until she wrote, in September, to say that she would be glad to see him, and when he came that second time, he came not alone, but with Lady Augusta beside him in the carriage, insisting, over his mild protest, that she had a stake in this reconciliation too great to be left at home. The proposal, when it finally came not in a grand room before witnesses, but on the same moor path where they had ridden all that first summer, the heather gone purple with autumn, and the wind carrying the particular clean cold of Yorkshire in October, and it came with no cup to set down and no room to walk out of, only the two of them and the open moor, and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother's own mother, offered with hands that were not entirely steady, and a voice that had learned, finally and properly, how to say a true thing plainly rather than hide it behind pride. Word of the engagement reached London within the fortnight, as such word always does, and this time the gossip that travelled was not of a duke making a fool of himself over a companion, but of a duke who had ridden through the night to undo a public wrong, and had spent half a year proving, in small and steady ways, that the undoing was sincere. And society, ever fickle in its judgments, found this version of the story considerably more romantic than the first, and repeated it with, evident relish at every dinner table between London and York. Lady Pride, informed of the engagement by the same cousin who had once carried the earlier gossip north, remarked to her daughter that it was, on the whole, a very great pity, though Lady Constance herself, who had never much wanted the Duke beyond what her mother wanted for her, confessed privately to a friend that she thought it rather fine, actually, that a man might be brought to admit so thoroughly and so publicly that he had been wrong. The wedding took place at Ashcombe in the spring, exactly a year after Eleanor had first come up the long drive with her trunk roped shut with twine, and Lady Augusta insisted on being wheeled to the front pew despite her hip, declaring that she had waited 70 years to see her grandson married properly, and did not intend to miss a moment of it for the sake of a little pain. The village turned out in numbers that surprised even the steward tenant families and shopkeepers, and the mail coach driver who had once been questioned so urgently on a public road, all of them come to see for themselves the companion who had walked out of a dinner with her dignity intact, and returned, in the end, as the Duchess of Ashcombe. Lord Farthing attended too, invited more out of Lady Augusta's insistence on correct form than any real warmth, and stood through the ceremony with the stiff bearing of a man who has not yet decided whether to forgive himself for words spoken a year before. It was Gideon who sought him out afterward, at the wedding breakfast, in front of enough of the assembled company that the gesture could not be mistaken for a private, easily forgotten courtesy, and raised his glass with a steadiness that carried the length of the room. My uncle once told me that a duke does not marry his grandmother's companion, and warned me that I would make a fool of myself if I tried. He was half right. I very nearly did make a fool of myself, not by marrying her, but by very nearly losing her through my own cowardice before I had the sense to recognise what I stood to lose. I would ask everyone here to raise a glass not only to my wife, though she deserves every glass raised in this room, and a great many more besides, but to the plain truth that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who can do nothing for him in return, a lesson my grandmother taught me long before I had the wit to believe I would ever need it. Lady Pride, seated near the back with an expression she could not entirely smooth into pleasantness, was heard afterward to remark to her daughter that the whole affair was really quite touching, whatever her private reservations, and Lord Farthing, for his part, crossed the room once the toasts had settled and extended a hand to Eleanor with a gruffness that did not entirely conceal genuine. Feeling beneath it, admitting that he had misjudged her, and that he did not make such admissions often, and that she ought therefore to consider it a compliment of some rarity. Eleanor accepted both the hand and the compliment with the same steady grace that had carried her out of that dining room a year before, and found, in the accepting, that the last of the old wound had finally, quietly, closed over. That evening, after the guests had gone and the house had settled into the particular quiet that follows a long celebration, Eleanor found herself in the blue drawing-room with a fresh cup of tea, the same room where the dinner had been held, and she set the cup down on its saucer with the same deliberate care she had used that terrible evening, though this time the sound that followed was not silence, but her husband's low laugh from the doorway, watching her. You are thinking of that dinner. I find I think of it more often than I would like to admit, though I no longer think of it only with pain. It taught me something I might otherwise never have learned, that a man's worst moment need not be his last word, if he is willing to do the harder work of proving it. Gideon crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking the hand that had set down the cup in both of his own, and looked up at her with the particular steadiness of a man who had learned, finally, that honesty offered without armour cost less than the pride that had once seemed so necessary to protect him. I will spend the whole of my life making certain you never again have cause to doubt your worth in any room I stand in, Eleanor. That is not a promise I make lightly, and it is not one I intend to let grow old with neglect the way so many promises do. I hold you to it, Your Grace. Outside the window, the moor stretched dark and quiet toward a horizon, just beginning to catch the last colour of the sunset. The same moor they had ridden together that first summer. The same house that had watched a companion arrive with a broken trunk clasp, and had watched her leave with her dignity unbroken, and had watched her, in the fullness of time, return to stay. The whole of that long year folded now into the settled, ordinary peace of an evening neither of them intended to take for granted. Lady Augusta, passing the drawing-room door on her way to bed, paused a moment to watch her grandson kneeling beside his new wife's chair, and continued on with a small, satisfied smile that she permitted no one to see, content in the knowledge that the lesson she had spent a lifetime failing to teach him had, in the end, been learnt the hard way. Which was, she reflected, very often the only way that lasting lessons were ever learnt at all. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.